All We Have Standing Between Us is made possible thanks to the generous support of the Knapp Family Foundation. Additional funding provided by the Leon Levy Foundation, the Achilles and Bodman Foundation, the Atran Foundation, and Anonymous. Visit the companion exhibition in New York City, on view at the Center for Jewish History, July 21st through December 31st, 2026.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
In 1961, actor and activist Henry Fonda went on the popular primetime Ed Sullivan Show, and in front of the live studio audience and millions of viewers who tuned in every Sunday night, recited President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The speech, which Lincoln gave in 1863, took place at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Pennsylvania and served as a rallying cry and a turning point in a war that had torn the nation apart. Invoking the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln reaffirmed that day that all men are created equal, a principle that had been denied to enslaved people for centuries. Welcome to All We Have Standing Between Us. I'm Gemma R. Birnbaum, Executive Director of the American Jewish Historical Society. Today's episode, A Leap into the Unknown, begins with the transatlantic slave trade.
It is a vast and forced population transfer from West Africa to North America, the Caribbean, and South America. And the numbers are beyond belief, astronomical. We're talking about 12 and 14 million humans, they're ordinary men, women, children, transported under horrific conditions to the New World. It's primarily from West Africa to the Caribbean and South America, so a smaller offshoot to North America.
Adam Mendelsohn is Associate Professor of History at the University of Cape Town.
And to business, this is enormously profitable and draw upon forced labor in the New World to make enormous profits, both in the New World, but also for investors and all sorts of other allied businesses in Europe as well. It really begins in the 15th century, but really takes off in the 16th century. It involves imperial players, it involves state businesses, individuals, private businesses, etc., and will continue well into the 19th century. The United States will end its involvement, at least officially, in the Atlantic slave trade by 1808, but there are a continuation of, again, ordinary men, women, and children brought illegally to the United States after that date.
Shari Rabin is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies, Religion, and History at Oberlin College.
When Jews settled in places where slavery was sort of built into the economy, to the social and political life, to the fabric of everyday life, they too participated in this system, which was a form of wealth acquisition. They certainly were not overrepresented or in control of the slave trade, as some anti-Semites would have it, but nor did they seem to be morally objecting or abstaining from it for any kind of reason. Jews were involved in the business of slavery and also were enslavers themselves when they had the resources to do it.
For as long as there was a slave economy, there were abolitionist voices and enslaved people who rebelled. In the Americas, some of the earliest and largest slave revolts began in the Caribbean, peaking between the 1760s and the 1830s. Nations including Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, and perhaps most famously, Haiti, were all sites of powerful uprisings.
So, of course, Africans would be the first abolitionists. The people experiencing the horrors of this system would certainly understand viscerally and immediately that it's wrong. The earliest voices you hear are sort of like from Quakers, particular kinds of peace-oriented, nonviolence-oriented religious groups, but it doesn't really become significant, a larger movement until the 19th century. And in the US, you start to see both the actions of enslaved people to try to overturn this system, for instance, Nat Turner, Dane-Mark Vesey, but then you also start to see white Christian folks like William Lloyd Garrison, the Grimke sisters of South Carolina, who are also coming to a recognition of the moral wrong of this system, and who are drawing on religious ideas, are offering their own sort of interpretations of biblical texts in order to argue for the end of this system.
The years leading up to the Civil War were rife with rising political tensions. In the 1840s, a rising anti-immigrant nativist movement began to gain traction. The American Party, more frequently referred to as the Know Nothing Party, formed in 1842, a backlash to the influx of recently arrived German and Irish immigrants. Co-founded and led by Lewis Levin, the second Jewish American ever elected to Congress, the party trafficked in conspiracy theories, including one especially incendiary claim that Catholics were attempting to subvert religious liberty in the United States. Know-nothing rhetoric, under Levin's leadership and beyond, encouraged and incited violence against Catholics and immigrant groups, including savage riots in Philadelphia that ended in people fleeing their homes, multiple churches burned to the ground, and more than 20 dead Irish Americans. The Know Nothing Party also began to have electoral success. They soon filled federal, state, and municipal seats around the country.
We see increasingly fiery politics in America well before the Civil War. So in the 1850s, as political tensions rise and as this conundrum becomes more and more clear, what is to become of slavery, you see bloodshed, bleeding Kansas and elsewhere, that there is already violence entering American political life, and a real uncertainty about where this is all heading, where this is all going to go.
The Border War, or what became known as Bleeding Kansas, lasted from 1854 until 1859. The fight over whether or not to allow slavery in the Kansas Territory turned violent in its earliest days, in a period marked by assault, murders in the streets, and electoral fraud, including one large-scale incident in which thousands of pro-slavery men, armed to the teeth, flooded into Kansas from neighboring Missouri and illegally cast votes for a pro-slavery Democrat running for Congress.
And a variety of efforts at compromise to try and work out a path forward. But then the election of Lincoln signals to some white Southerners that there is no path forward in their minds, which is unacceptable to them.
We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract.
On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States in one of the most consequential elections in American history.
He's not a sort of ardent abolitionist. He's talking about something much more narrow. He wants to try to keep the Union together, but he and his party are associated with the anti-slavery cause. And in December of 1860, South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union. This sort of continues into the spring of 1861. Mississippi's early, and then there's sort of, you keep seeing states secede, especially after Lincoln sort of calls up troops to be prepared for the onset of hostilities. Those hostilities then come in April of 1861 at Fort Sumter.
In the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, while Union soldiers slept, lookouts witnessed a flaming mortar shot race across the sky. The shot, was a signal to troops from the newly formed Confederate States of America to mobilize. And within hours, outmanned and outgunned, the Union Army was fighting against an all-out assault. A civil war had begun, and for the next 4 years, 1 month, and 2 weeks, life would be marked by a blood-drenched, divisive reality. The majority of American Jews lived in the North, and many Jews enlisted, defending the Union even as wartime anti-Semitism was on the rise. In one infamous event, on December 17, 1862, Union General Ulysses S. Grant issued an order to expel all Jews from his military district.
The expulsion order is it's an extraordinary act. Grant makes this order while campaigning along the Mississippi. He's trying to capture Vicksburg. Vicksburg is a fortress city along the Mississippi, sort of strategically important city. And it's a campaign which is disastrous in many ways. For Grant, it's, he gets stuck in the mud of the Mississippi. A variety of efforts to take Vicksburg fail. And so there's in the background, there's a certain level of despair, demoralization, difficulty, which is important to understand this. There's also other context here too, deeper context, which is that the northern economy, particularly cotton manufacturing industries in the Northeast, rely on cotton from the South. And that cotton supply is cut off early on in the war.
At the beginning of the war, President Lincoln imposed a blockade, which cut off the Confederacy from trading with the North and other nations. A black market economy soon developed, and Grant accused, quote, Jews as a class of violating the blockade and being responsible for these black market dealings.
And we see it in this mix of frustration at the military campaign plus the frustration at this allowance for civilian traders to pass through their lines, that we see Grant and his lieutenants fulminating against these civilian traders. What they do is what's typical of the times, which is to often begin to use the term trader and Jew and smuggler interchangeably. Again, this draws on earlier wartime anti-Semitism, which really takes off in 1861. And so Grant's order is a reflection of this frustration which grows into rage.
In the South, some Jews prayed for victory, while others supported the war effort financially. There were also Southern Jews who served in the Confederate Army and helped the Confederacy through intelligence gathering. Rosanna Osterman, a nurse, turned her home into a hospital.
Rosanna Osterman is a German-speaking immigrant to Texas in the 1830s who becomes a really important early member of the Jewish community in Galveston, Texas. She's involved in establishing the first Jewish cemetery there in 1852. Her and her husband, establish a very comfortable life in Galveston. They're very well-to-do. Her husband dies in 1861. She stays in Galveston during the Civil War.
When the Union successfully occupied Galveston, Rosanna treated wounded Northern soldiers in her makeshift hospital. It is said that while providing medical care to an injured Union soldier, she learned of his regiment's battle plans and passed those on to the Confederate Army, information that helped the Confederacy retake Galveston. For the remainder of the war, she continued to provide medical care to the wounded. Among the most high-ranking and well-known Confederate Jews was Judah P. Benjamin, who rose to Secretary of State under the CSA's president, Jefferson Davis. Born in the West Indies to British Sephardic Jewish parents in 1811, he was a vocal supporter of slavery.
Judah P. Benjamin himself was an immigrant to the United States, born in the Caribbean, came to Charleston as a young man, really grew up in Charleston, and then had a sort of a relatively short-lived career at Yale before striking out, as did many other South Carolinians, for the frontier. So in his case, moving to Louisiana, a number of other Jews from South Carolina did likewise and were very successful in Louisiana. And he started as a lawyer, and again, successful lawyer, became enmeshed in some sort of leading political circles within New Orleans, and ultimately attains political office. It serves in the Senate in the 1850s, representing Louisiana, forms some sort of relationship with Jefferson Davis in the Senate as well, fellow senator, and certainly speaks out in 1860 in favor of secession as well.
Known for being an accomplished and charismatic orator, Benjamin resigned from the Senate to serve the Confederacy with an impassioned speech, in which he urged for a bloodless separation while also appearing aggressively defiant against the North. After his resignation, he fled D.C. and returned to New Orleans, hoping to avoid arrest. After Davis's appointment as president of the Confederacy, he became something of a right-hand man to the leader.
He's recruited by Jefferson Davis to serve as Attorney General within the Confederacy, and he begins this meteoric rise shortly thereafter, serving briefly as Secretary of War, but then for much of the war as Secretary of State, which is a tremendously important role given that the Confederacy's strategy is really to avoid military defeat, but ultimately to win international recognition, that desperately seeks British and French recognition. That this is its pathway to permanence. This is how it will survive. So Judah P. Benjamin's role as Secretary of State is crucially important in this. And likewise, the Secretary of State is also responsible for the Confederacy spy network as well. Clearly, Judah P. Benjamin is very, very competent during the war and close to Jefferson Davis, and there's a lot of speculation about their relationship as well. What role does Judah P. Benjamin's Jewishness play in this? And I think what's interesting here is that Jefferson Davis has a number of other religious minorities within his cabinet as well. So it's not exclusively, Judah P. Benjamin doesn't necessarily stand out exclusively as being sort of different. Likewise, there are other Jews within prominent roles within the Confederacy as well.
On April 8, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, paving the way for the end of the Civil War. As news spread, celebrations erupted across the North. Just days later, on the evening of April 14th, President Lincoln was shot by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. He died the next morning, sending a fragile and still fractured nation into mourning and into even more uncertainty and chaos. In the hours that followed, Vice President Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president. Judah P. Benjamin fled to Britain and found a second career as a barrister. As for Rosanna Osterman, she wrote an impassioned letter to Johnson for amnesty.
The letter that she wrote shortly after the Civil War in September of 1865 to President Andrew Johnson. It was a petition to receive amnesty. Johnson gave a general amnesty to Southerners. Otherwise, they could have all been charged with treason. And he said, I'm going to give a general amnesty except for people within certain categories. And that included people who had a significant amount of wealth. So they had to write letters requesting their citizenship back, essentially. And, Johnson himself was from Tennessee. He was not really looking to punish people. And some of these letters, including letters by Jews, you see them admitting, listen, I'm a Southerner. I was allied with the South. That's that. Please, can you grant me amnesty? But Osterman's letter really kind of movingly talks about her loyalty to the Union and her opposition to secession. She says that she, never supported this cause and would have wanted to stay within the Union. So it's really incredible to see this kind of evidence of Jewish political diversity. She dies in 1866 during a steamship accident, very 19th century demise. But her will is really fascinating. She's very generous, and she really spreads her wealth across a wide array of causes, both Jewish and non-Jewish, local to Galveston, Southern, national, and even international.
The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain.
Ultimately, nearly 4 million enslaved people were freed during and after the Civil War. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified and made slavery and involuntary servitude illegal, except as punishment for a crime. It was the first of 3 Reconstruction amendments that would be passed in the aftermath of the war, as the nation grappled with how to rebuild.
The war is over, and the question is, what is going to be now? What is this country going to look like in the absence of slavery and in the aftermath of this very, very bloody war? So those are the questions in play. There remain, federal troops in the South after the war to try to ensure that there's order, that freed people are freed, in fact. And then, there's all sorts of questions. These southern states are required to create new constitutions, for instance. So they have to have constitutional conventions. There's all sorts of debates and struggles within the federal government, within Congress, about sort of how to sort of keep this region in line. A series of Reconstruction Acts are passed, new constitutional amendments, abolishing slavery, bringing citizenship to and voting to freed people. The sort of building blocks of a new kind of America are being put into place. Some historians call this the second founding. In some ways, it really is a new nation being created sort of on the ashes of the old one. And there's tremendous political conflict within the South in these years after the war. Democrats versus Republicans, literal fighting in the streets, violence, murder.
This is a period of tremendous uncertainty and anxiety for American Jews. That certainly, part of that uncertainty amongst the Jewish population in the North relates to what will the status of Jews be after the second founding. Political leaders within the Democrat Party and other political leaders are warning that there will be consequences for immigrants and consequences for white folk, particularly those who are lower down the social and economic ladder. Many Jews share those anxieties. And likewise, Jews within the South, there's also this tremendous period of uncertainty. This entire economic and political system is being remade, and remade with tremendous violence, as Shari has described as well. So it's a period of tremendous uncertainty, and where there are moments where Jews are targeted as well.
On Christmas Eve, 1865, 6 former Confederate officers gathered in Pulaski, Tennessee. It was there that they founded the Ku Klux Klan. Originally founded as a fraternal social club, the Klan soon became a white supremacist organization, dedicated to racist violence that members deemed vigilante justice. Klan members dedicated themselves to inflicting fear on newly freed African Americans, and did so through acts of domestic terrorism, intimidation, and in some cases, even through service in law enforcement and political office. Their mass marauding included property damage, rape, and lynchings. A rebellion against the progress and promise of Reconstruction, the Klan also terrorized immigrants, Catholics, and Jews.
During the Reconstruction period, on the one hand, you have Jewish Republican politicians. On the other hand, you have Jewish Democratic politicians aligned with the sort of majority white supremacist party. But then you also have, in the congressional hearings about the first Ku Klux Klan, there are descriptions of 3 Jewish merchants being murdered by the Klan. So Jews are occupying this sort of complicated status. Certainly during the Civil War, there are moments of persecution and discrimination towards Jews, and certainly with the Seligman affair.
In June 1877, the prominent Jewish banker Joseph Seligman was turned away from the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, New York. Hotel staff cited a policy that stated, quote, "No Israelites shall be permitted in the future to stop at this hotel."
The Seligman affair, as it's often described, is the birth of modern American anti-Semitism, but certainly that there are roots earlier in this era, that to understand the Seligman affair, you actually have to understand then what happens in the Civil War and then the aftermath of the Civil War as well. And I think there is broad agreement amongst historians of American Jewish life what follows, that this is a moment in a way which does signal to American society that the exclusion of Jews is acceptable. And particularly with the arrival in the 1870s, but increasingly in the 1880s and afterwards, of vast numbers of new Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, that these ideas which have been rooted during the war, that Jews are unassimilable, that they can disloyal, that they are un-American in various ways, that they don't know their place in American society, they can never become proper Americans.
The first wave of the Klan was ultimately disbanded through federal intervention by the late 1870s. But the group would go through several periods of resurgence throughout the 20th century. While the fight to save the Union was a success, the nation grappled with the challenges of Reconstruction for decades.
That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
From the American Jewish Historical Society, I'm Gemma R. Birnbaum. This episode was written by me. Recording, sound design, and mixing were done at Sound Lounge. Archival material is from the AJHS Collection and SOFA Entertainment. For episode transcripts, additional resources, and links to the collections discussed in this episode, visit ajhs.org/democracy. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on your preferred podcast platform, which helps others discover our series.